If you're watching this video, there's a strong chance that you know about the Sims games. Many gamers know of them, even if most gamers don't or haven't played any of the games. If you think back to your childhood, if you're a guy, chances are you know of the Sims games because your sister, or your cousin, or your female friend played the game. I've played the games myself, and they are certainly a treat. That is before EA carved them up like Christmas dinner and sold the morsels of gameplay back to the consumer. But that's definitely another video. According to Statista, in 2019, amongst the US gamer population, 46% of them are female. In 2006, that percentage was just 32%. The use of the US population data is important because the US is one of the biggest gaming markets. So if you really want to see what game trends are like, looking at the US is a good way to do it. So looking now, we are almost reaching something of a gender parity in video games. This alone is very promising, as at least when I was growing up, gaming was always regarded as a boys' hobby, and there were few girls who ever got any exposure to it really. On this data alone, we might be tempted to assume that the gaming industry has improved on its gender problems. But as is the case in real life, you don't need to be a numerical minority to be a social minority, and women are still typically marginalized in the games industry. One example of that would be the dominance of traditionally male-orientated gaming genres at the top of sales. Action games, shooters, sports games, and RPGs are all at the top. These are very much games that are aimed towards men, advertised to them, and built up around them. After all, why would female soldiers in combat zones wear skimpy clothes? Why would the default FPS character be a strong-jawed male super soldier? It's because these are ways in which games are catered towards men as their primary target market. The game genres that do best with women, puzzle games and casual games, as you can see, would be lumped into the other genre. So despite almost having gender parity in terms of who is buying games, there is very much an asymmetrical distribution between the genres of those games and therefore who would be playing those games in whatever numbers. So what is going on here? Why is The Sims as a game series so popular with women? At its heart, The Sims is a simulation game. Every game is, of course, a simulation, but not every game is a simulation game. So what is a simulation game, then, if all games are some form of simulation? Well, typically, a simulation game will try to recreate something in the real world for the player to manage through the medium of the game. Many of the first games were simulation games precisely because making a copy of a real-world thing is much easier than trying to create something wholly new from scratch. When you think of a simulation game, you should be thinking of managing a resource or a community or a process. This does not necessarily require one-to-one replication of reality, just a greater focus on the recreation of a reality. For example, a game like Stardew Valley is a simulation of being a farmer. Sure, it's not as realistic as Farming Simulator 2019, with its billion kinds of crops and big agribusiness waiting in the wings to steal your land. Well, maybe it is. Both of these games let you imagine the experience of being a farmer and managing a farm. You aren't on any epic quest. Your quest is your farm. The core gameplay loop, to be a bit technical, revolves around planting crops and growing them. Everything else is built around this. So what is The Sims a simulation of? Well, The Sims is a development of an earlier game called SimCity, a game literally about being a mayor of a city. You had a virtual city over which you could dictate housing policy, zoning, and of course, giant robot disaster relief. And it was, for the time, a pretty popular franchise. The Sims, however, came about when the developers, Maxis, decided to focus specifically on the social aspect of their city simulation and zoomed all the way in. So now, instead of a city, you control just a handful of people who live in a house that you, of course, design, and these people live virtual lives with you as a sort of voyeur, part mastermind, that recreates a virtual dollhouse style of gameplay. It has proved to be a pretty popular franchise and is the best-selling PC game franchise of all time. It is also proven to be really popular with women, far more than men. And yet despite this, The Sims isn't advertised to women in the ways that you'd see shooter games advertised to men. It isn't marketed specifically to them or around them, if it is actually marketed anymore. And yet, it is one of the few massively popular franchises in gaming where women outnumber males specifically. There are several factors at work behind The Sims and its popularity with women. The first one, and the one that most obviously jumps to mind, is that The Sims is a dollhouse, albeit a virtual one, and that society has raised generations of women through conditioning to play with dollhouses as a way of reinforcing the maternal roles that it expects of them. So in this sense, the popularity of The Sims is just the idea of the dollhouse taken to the new digital age. In a similar way, where FPS games are the new army men for boys, The Sims is the new dollhouse for girls. This is, of course, a fairly simple explanation, but it definitely leaves room for more. After all, gaming is still traditionally a male-dominated space, and because the gaming culture hasn't really changed, yet the demographics have, there is still a perception that gaming isn't for women. We've all seen the rather toxic gamer memes, and plenty of women still report facing harassment for entering traditionally male gaming spaces online, like for example in FPSs. So in a way, there's something of an outlier for The Sims to do so well. It does well in spite of the hostility to it by gamers who see games less catered to the male traditional expectations as weaker. For example, the perception that a walking simulator is less of a game than, say, for example, an FPS game. It speaks to something of a rebellious space, then, carved out by women in a domain where they are traditionally excluded, something of a refuge where women can create content for themselves. One last point to consider, though. Capitalism sucks. In a theme which will become prevalent throughout this channel, I dislike capitalism immensely, and one of the things I dislike the most about it is how it atomizes and isolates people. One part of the way capitalism interacts with society is that we're increasingly seeing social isolation amongst people, both younger and older. For young people, they simply aren't making what they used to be able to. More of their time is spent working, often multiple jobs just to pay rent. For the elderly, the increasing cuts to social services leaves them more vulnerable to be unable to afford health services that keep them engaged in society even as they age. And this intersects with women in particular. The ability of a woman today to be a stay-at-home wife while her husband makes the entire income of the household is a fading one, if not one that is already dead. It simply isn't possible for a family to be raised on a single income. Even in a household with two parents, both of them have to get full-time, often many jobs, to support even a few children. While many women do find fulfillment, and this is a good thing, definitely, in their careers, the option to pick between a career and domestic life is not one that they are readily given, definitely not in comparison to men. So in this sense, if you're a young woman who is told that you need to pick family, but you pick career, The Sims is a way of vicariously meeting the social pressure exerted onto you without actually having to do it. Looking at The Sims, it's easy to see a fun game. It is, by my own admission, cathartic to put some Sims in a pool and take away the ladder, or to watch them all flail in panic as a fire breaks out and they just stare. But looking deeper, The Sims has evolved into many things, beyond its original scope as just a mere toy. It's a social outlet for the dissatisfied youth, it's a carved-out niche for the excluded, and it's social conditioning taken to a new digital era. It's all these things and more, and that's what makes it worth playing.